Welcome everyone to ITIF's webinar, Energizing Innovation, Federal Energy RD&D, that's Research, Development, and Demonstration in the fiscal year 2022 and beyond. My name is David Hart. I'm a senior fellow at ITIF, a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and I run the Clean Energy Innovation Policy Program at ITIF. Today's event marks the release of ITIF's annual report on DOE's Energy RD&D budget. And above all, this event is meant to invite the community to use the data and information that's in the report as a resource as we move through the current cycle and beyond. It's a bittersweet moment for us. Colin Cunliffe, the lead author of the report and my partner for the last 3 years in the program, is not presenting today because as of Friday, he's an employee of the Department of Energy in the Office of Policy, which is great for DOE, great for the country, but a little bit sad for us here at ITIF. So in any case, I'm going to fill in as the lead presenter, but most of the work is Colin's and Lynn Nguyen, who thankfully remains with us here at ITIF. We're very pleased to welcome Deputy Secretary of Energy Dave Turk to the program to offer some opening remarks. I heard that Colin was actually writing some of them, so he's doing double duty today in any case. Dave Turk was confirmed to the #2 job in DOE on March 24th, and he can already chalk up some big successes, most notably the Climate Leaders Summit that was held during April. Before joining DOE, Dave served as the Deputy Executive Director at the International Energy Agency, which also released an important report this week, and I'm sure that's a fruit of his work there. Before going to IEA, he held senior roles in the White House and in the State Department under the Obama administration. After Dave's remarks, I'll introduce the rest of the panel, Aaron Burns, Rebecca Dell, and Lindsay Baxter Griffith. I'll present the report. Aaron or Rebecca will offer some remarks, and Lindsay may as well before leading a discussion. Just a heads up for viewers, we're going to run a few minutes longer than originally planned if people have questions until about 12:10, so we have more time to answer them. So please stick around. Submit your questions through the Slido panel on the web stream. And if you're tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag Energy Budget. And with that, let me invite Dave Turk to make some remarks. Thank you, Dave, for joining us.
Well, first of all, David, let me thank you not only for the very kind introduction, but more importantly, let me thank you for all your outstanding efforts for many, many years in this area. I have been a consumer of all your efforts, and Colin and others at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and have really benefited from your leadership. And I know so many of us who are participating as panelists, but also participating and listening in on this webinar as well have benefited. And let me add a particular thanks to Colin for the excellent report and analysis working with you, David, and your other colleagues, but also for joining the not only the U.S. government, but the Department of Energy and our policy office, as you mentioned. That's a huge pickup for us here at the Department of Energy, and I know Colin will do extraordinary work here at the department, just like he did extraordinary work at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation as well. And it's terrific to be here with Rebecca, Aaron, and Lindsay, as well as some colleagues that I've known for many years and huge leaders in their own right in this area also. So phenomenal panel, phenomenal presentation. I'll try to keep my opening remarks here relatively short, and happy to answer a few questions, David, as helpful before I need to go on with other pressing matters as well. So let me just start with a few observations, and then I'll get into a little bit about what we've been doing at DOE over the last few months of this administration, and then how we think about things and what's looking coming forward, not only in the FY22 budget proposal and submission, but also in the American Jobs Plan, because the two are interrelated as we look ahead on the innovation front and what we're trying to do from the department and the U.S. government perspective. First point I'd like to make is, and sometimes in the Twitterverse that some of us live in and some of us spend relatively less time in, but sometimes in Twitter and elsewhere, you get into these arguments about, we need to focus on deployment, or we need to focus on innovation. And that kind of discussion, I have to say, drives me a little bit crazy sometimes. And that if you want to get to net zero, if you want to be aggressive on the climate side of things, you just have to do both. And the two are very much interrelated and really benefit from focusing on both. So just to say that piece. On the innovation piece in particular, it's been terrific to see such strong bipartisan support for innovation on the clean energy side of things, from Democrats, from Republicans, from independents, from across a wide variety of ideologies, a wide variety of regional backgrounds and perspectives. We certainly saw evidence of this in the Energy Act of 2020, recently enacted not too long ago. And we may have some staffers and others who are very much involved in that effort. And thank you for the terrific support for the department, but the terrific efforts more broadly in that Energy Act of 2020. I think that's a very, very important marker out there. Also, thanks for the support for the Department of Energy and the 17 national labs that we've got. For those who've had a chance to visit our labs or to work at the department or to work with the department, it's a phenomenal not only group of facilities out there, cutting edge, world-class facilities, but phenomenal talent, people who have made their careers in public service at our national labs, at the Department of Energy, trying to day in and day out develop new technologies, try to commercialize those new technologies to really try to get solutions at scale. I've been meeting one-on-one with all of the national lab directors. I actually finished my 17th of the lab director discussions very early in my tenure. Just finished my last one yesterday. It's an incredibly impressive group, and it's such a national treasure that we should build upon. And I know ITIF's work has really focused on this. And at the department, we feel a sense of responsibility. We feel a sense of responsibility that we've got these labs, we've got these phenomenal scientists, we've got these phenomenal folks working in our labs and in our department. And how do we get the most out of that? How do we leverage that fully so that we can be successful given the historic moment in time that we're living in? So with that in mind, in that context, let me just highlight a few things we've already done in the few months we've been in place in this new administration at the department, trying to, again, take advantage of the historic opportunity. And then I'll get into a little bit on the American Jobs Plan and FY22 budget submission. First, we're trying to bring greater coherence alignment with all of our tools across the spectrum. So from basic science to commercialization and everything that comes in between. One tangible example of that is to create a single undersecretary for science and energy. So bringing in our Office of Science, our applied offices like ERE, our Nuclear Energy Office, our Fossil Energy Office, all together under one house with the loan program, with our Office of Technology Transitions, so that we can have more coherence. We can think about whether it's hydrogen or long duration storage or carbon dioxide removal. We can think about these much more in a coherent, cohesive whole, and really trying to bring these technologies, again, as quickly as we can from scientific discovery to commercialization at scale. So that's a big part of what we have done and we are doing, and we'll look to do even further of that alignment, coherence, and stay tuned for some announcements coming out in the few weeks coming forward. Secondly, we're looking at all of our offices at the department and making sure that they are fully retooled, fully revamped, fully empowered to deal with the challenges, but the opportunities going forward. So I mentioned our Fossil Energy Office. That's now been not only renamed, but more importantly, revamped and targeted in very important ways. So it's now the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office, really reflecting the breadth of this incredibly important mission, and happy to get into that in more detail as useful. We're continuing to push the technology price points, putting out ambitious targets on solar. We've launched a new goal to cut the cost of solar energy another 60% within the last 10 years. So building on the incredible progress we've seen on solar so far and pushing that envelope even further going forward. We've set, as many of you I'm sure have seen, a new bold goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, with some funding announcements and other kinds of levers already in place. We've launched our Super Truck 3 initiative, looking at a variety of sustainable transportation technologies, really trying to push the envelope there. And those are just a few examples. Almost every day at the department, we have a new funding opportunity, really trying to, again, leverage and really push these key technologies forward. Again, as quickly as we can, from basic science to research, development, deployment, demonstration, and then commercialization at scale. So that's what we've been doing, but it's really only a down payment. And I think the report that's going to be discussed today really underlines this. It's a down payment on what we need to do, and this historic opportunity to really up our game even further. Not just to achieve our climate objectives, but to build the economy that we need to build the competitiveness that we need to going forward. So with that in mind, let me just give you a few highlights from the American Jobs Plan in particular that's now pending in Congress. Congress is having hearings. Congress is looking at all sorts of components of the jobs plan and writing that bill right now. Certainly, as proposed by President Biden, it's no exaggeration to say that this is the biggest investment in America since World War II, and really a once-in-a-generation investment in our economy and our energy infrastructure in particular that we're here to talk about today. So among other things, it has a proposal for $40 billion to upgrade the research infrastructure in our laboratories across the country, including and especially in our 17 national labs that I mentioned in the Department of Energy. It has $15 billion proposed in key demonstration projects and utility scale energy storage and CCS and hydrogen to really make sure that we have those demonstration projects in place in communities to advance that commercialization agenda. And again, get those technologies at scale the way we need to with some real urgency and thoughtfulness associated with them. There's 20 billions in regional innovation hubs. And these are billions with a B, not with an M. This is the scale of what we're talking about in the American Jobs Plan. And we certainly look forward to continuing our conversations with members of Congress, with staff, whatever we can do from the Department of Energy side to inform the congressional decision making and to try to all work together to seize this incredible moment that we have in front of us. Our FY22 budget request, which will come out in full form and more detailed form next Thursday, May 27th, is similarly ambitious. Proposals to increase our budget significantly in a wide variety of areas. $10 billion proposed for government-wide clean energy innovation, of which $8 billion would flow through Department of Energy programs. $1 billion specifically for ARPA-E and ARPA-C, ARPA-C being a new ARPA-C focused additionally on some key climate technologies. That is a big deal and a big ramp up from where we've historically been. $1.9 billion for a new clean energy projects and workforce initiative. So a lot of significant proposals in that FY22 budget. And again, it should be useful to think about the American Jobs Plan, the FY22 budget, working together, dovetailing together, and putting us on the course that we need to going forward. So let me stop there. Hopefully that's a little bit of helpful context and what we've been doing and what we will be doing, hope to be doing at the Department of Energy side. Of course, working hand in hand with our appropriators, with our authorizers, with those of you who are working on Capitol Hill, again, to really seize this moment in time. I firmly believe that this is one of those moments in history we either look back on 5 years, 10 years from now, and hopefully all collectively say, we really seized this moment, we took advantage of it, we worked together, and we put innovation, we put clean energy, we put our country, we put our competitiveness on the right path that we need going forward. So let me stop there, David. And again, thanks for all that ITIF does, all our other panelists do. And thank you also to Colin for making the transition over to the Department of Energy side of things as well. David, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. And we expect a player to be named later to come over to us in the trade at some point. So we'll look forward to that. So I think I'll just take the opportunity to ask one question, which is I wonder if you have any reflections on the net zero report that IEA put out yesterday and how that ought to shape any of our thinking. You'll see I use one of their graphs, and we use their work in our reports. And since you were recently there, and I think one of the innovation leaders at IEA, and what a remarkable contribution that organization has made, and credit to you for that. But I wonder if you have any brief thoughts that you might want to share on that new report.
Well, thanks for that, David. And if folks have not had a chance yet to take a look at that report, whether the executive summary or the 200 pages of deep, rigorous analysis that goes into it, it's an incredible accomplishment. And a real credit to Dr. Fatih Birol, the head of IEA, Laura Coetzee, Timur Gul, the full team at IEA. This is, as I was telling Fatih a few days ago, I think this is a seminal piece of work, not just for the IEA, but I think for the broader discussion and the broader consensus forming on not only that we need to achieve net zero and need to achieve it in just a few decades period of time, but really a consensus that it's not just good enough to set those targets. We actually have to have rigorous, credible, trackable, measurable plans to achieve that. And that's what the IEA has tried to put out, doing some, I think, phenomenal analysis. It's a very ambitious plan to get to net zero in that kind of way with the rigor. It's not an easy plan. I think that goes without saying, but it would benefit everyone from taking a look and exploring just what it means to fundamentally transform our energy economies in very, very ambitious, very aggressive ways, pulling all the levers that are available and some that need to be developed and evolved even further. To me, it underscores maybe 2 points for this conversation in particular, David. One is the point that I started with, that it's not just good enough to focus on deployment or innovation. You've got to focus on both, and you've got to think about these pieces, these technologies in a seamless kind of way. And the report, I think, underscores that incredibly well. And then it also underscores that everyone has to be part of the solution. If we're going to get to net zero by 2030, it's not good enough for a few countries to do it and other countries not to do it. Everybody needs to be part of it from the government side of things. We need corporate leadership. We need investment leadership. We need folks who are investing their careers in this space going forward. This is an all hands on deck, not just challenge, but opportunity. And again, hopefully we're able to take advantage of this historic opportunity. But thanks for the question, David, and congratulations to my former IEA colleagues for the terrific work that they pulled off here.
Thanks again. So we'll let you go, but let me just reiterate how exciting it is for those of us who have been working on this theme for a number of years to have a partner in the administration that is listening, that is putting so many of these priorities and into the budget and putting resources where the logic is. And we look forward to continuing to engage and wish you the best as this work moves forward. So we'll let you go. We'll bring up the rest of the panel, and I'll introduce them now. Thank you. So immediately after my presentation, I'm going to turn the moderator's chair over to Lindsay Baxter Griffith. Lindsay is the Federal Policy Director at the Clean Air Task Force, one of our frequent collaborators, and she's also the Executive Director of CATF's Action Arm. Prior to joining CATF, she served as the policy advisor to Senator Markey of Massachusetts and at the DOE's Office of Energy Policy, among other things. Rebecca Dell will speak after me. She leads the industry program for Climate Works Foundation. That program is the largest philanthropic program in the world dedicated to reducing and eliminating the 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the material economy. Like Lindsay, Rebecca worked at DOE under the Obama administration, where she coordinated the implementation of President Obama's climate action plan and was the lead analyst and author of the U.S. Quadrennial Energy Review. And then following Rebecca, Erin Burns will make some remarks. She's the executive director of Carbon 180, a climate non-governmental organization that's focused on the full range of carbon removal solutions. Also, like Lindsay, she worked in the Senate on a range of issues. And immediately prior to joining Carbon 180, she helped lead the climate energy program at Third Way, like CATF and Carbon 180, another of ITIF's fellow travelers. So Rebecca and Aaron are going to highlight some aspects of federal investment that have been underemphasized in the past and are starting to make an appearance. And I think we'd all like to see those areas grow. And again, really pleased that all three of you could join us and look forward to the discussion later, and invite people watching to put their questions in. So with that, I'm going to ask Lindsay to start my clock and turn to ITIS report and make my presentation. So as I mentioned, this is really Colin Cunliffe's baby, with a lot of help this time around from Lynn Nguyen. It's the fourth time that we've done reports, so we have a nice time series that drills down all the way to the sub-program level. So if you could advance to the third slide. The report has several parts to it. There's an overview and perspective that provides historical and comparative context, about 15 or 20 pages. Then there are briefings on 21 specific programs. We try to summarize recommendations that we and others have made over the years on each of those programs. And then new this year, we have a visualization. And let me credit Kayleen Schreiber, who's been working with us closely on that. Whether or not you agree with us on our recommendations, I certainly hope you'll use these data. Bookmark that URL that's listed in the slide. And I think you'll find that there is more detail and more easy to use data than what you'll find elsewhere. So, so I hope it's a resource for the community. That's the most important thing. Next slide, please. So the title of the report talks about ambition, and this is a figure taken from the recent report that Dave Turk just talked about. We use the metaphor of a moonshot in the blog, and the question, you might ask the question, why? And the short answer is that the technologies that we need to address climate change aren't ready to be used on a global scale. It's not that they have to be discovered, but in most cases, they're just not ready. And then the ones that are listed as on the market can still be improved, and they should be improved. So this IEA report provides a nice summary of the case. If the world is going to get to net zero by 2050 and meet the legitimate aspirations of everyone on the planet to access basic energy services, then we're going to need to rely on many technologies that are still under development. And those are the red, orange, and yellow bars on the right-hand side of this graphic. It's close to half of all the emissions reductions that IEA found in its net zero scenario. And the ones in the green block, as I mentioned, can also use some help, although we think the private sector should be leading in technologies that are already on the market. So as Dave said, there's no conflict between innovation and deployment. They are complementary. Next slide, please. So we need more innovation. The US is the world science and technology leader, so it needs to play a big role. And I think this thesis, again, as Dave Turk remarked, has found broad acceptance across both parties, across both chambers of Congress, and in the Biden administration as well. And a lot of important steps were taken in the 2020 Energy Act. Next slide. But it's not nearly enough. So this chart shows federal energy RD&D spending over time. And you can see the blue bars marching upward. That's absolute spending. As mentioned in the previous slide, there has been progress. There's been rapid increases in energy RD&D budgets. But as a share of the economy, and that's what's highlighted on the orange slide, we are basically flat for the last decade. So there's a peak around the Recovery Act of 2009, but ever since then, we've basically been flatlining. Next slide, please. So this figure also appears in the report. We're still working with the same indicator that I was speaking about in the previous slide, federal energy RD&D investment as a share of GDP. That's the dark blue line at the bottom, the short one. It's way less than we spent on a comparable indicator for the Manhattan Project, for the Apollo program, for the Reagan era defense buildup, even the first energy crisis when DOE was set up. Those are the gray bars at the top. And energy RD&D as a share of GDP lags behind our national investment in health RD&D, and it lags behind what China is doing relative to its GDP. So those are the blue and the orange bars at the bottom. So you can choose your benchmark by any of these standards. US isn't taking the innovation needed to make the energy transition seriously enough. So we've got to get serious and really raise our ambition. Next slide, please. So Colin and I and colleagues from Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy published a book last year, and we set out a pathway to triple the investment across the whole of government over 5 years. But DOE still lies at the core of that investment. So the two bottom layers on this graphic, the orange and blue layers, those are both parts of DOE. So you can see that they would still play a major role. And it would also probably have a large role in the demonstration project, which is the gray slice at the top. So as we think about expanding the government-wide investment, there's no question that DOE will play a central role. And Colin prepared a detailed 5-year budget plan that goes through fiscal 2026. And all of those figures are included in our report. So as you go through the programs, you can see what we've proposed as funding levels for those specific technology areas. Next slide, please. So here's what we're talking about. Everything in the big wheel on the right side, so that colorful wheel, has 21 programs, and they're listed down the side. The Office of Science has the biggest slice. That's the beigey colored slices. Nuclear energy is next. That's the maroon slice towards the bottom. But there's a huge diversity of technologies, and we're adding new topics, as Rebecca and Aaron are going to speak about. But it's also worth remembering that the Department of Energy does a lot of other stuff. So sometimes people call it the Department of Everything. The $8 billion that we identify as energy RD&D is only about 20%. So if you read about DOE's total budget, just keep in mind that not all of it goes into the energy innovation mission. Next slide, please. So those points are the essence of the main report. And then if you want to dig into a particular topic area, there's a write-up and a visualization on each. And again, thanks to Lynn and Kayleen for their work on these graphics. So I've illustrated them here with a geothermal. So this is the geothermal program. But you could do this with solar, with nuclear, with any of the slices. And for each of these areas, you can see to the left side of the graphic, each subprogram. So the last 5 years, as I said, this is our 4th time around. So we've built up a nice time series. The past appropriations by subprogram. And then you can look ahead to the authorized levels and the proposed levels. And this is a lot nicer in our interactive graphic on the website. So this is just the static version here. And then if you want to dig in deeper, you can download the data, play around with it yourself. So again, I invite everyone to access the report. I've just given the highest level summary here. And I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay and invite our other speakers to make remarks. So thank you again for joining us today. And Lindsay, the podium is yours.
Thanks, David, for that great overview, and congratulations to ITIF for yet another successful annual report. I'm very excited about the data visualization myself, able to dig into that tool and see at the level of the applied energy offices what's going on and where the Energy Act of 2020 puts things in line with the Energizing America report. It's a great resource. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now for her remarks.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful panel and such an important topic to dive into. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time on a subject very close to my heart, which is manufacturing, climate, and innovation. So next slide, please. So why do I think we need to, why is it a good idea to spend some time focusing on the industrial sector? Well, industry is on track to become the highest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the United States within the next 5 years. Here are some, I'm showing here some projections from the Rhodium Group, but many analysts have done similar analyses and come to similar conclusions. We're making progress in the power sector, we're making progress in the transportation sector, we're moving in the wrong direction on the industrial sector. In addition to these trends, it's important to remember that the US imports the equivalent of another 800 million tons of CO2 per year of industrial emissions in other countries, as those emissions were generated in producing products that we import. And so Everybody loves manufacturing jobs. Everybody wants to reshore that production. Everybody wants to increase the percentage of our manufacturing consumption, our consumption of manufactured goods that comes from US-based manufacturers. But to the extent that we are successful at that, that is going to even add more upward pressure on our national industrial emissions. Next slide, please. So I think the first thing to do is to kind of level set around what are we currently spending on manufacturing and industry R&D investment in the US federal government. And just to clarify terms, when we say industry, that's a little bit broader than manufacturing. That typically includes manufacturing, construction, and waste processing. So the biggest portion of the manufacturing and industry R&D currently in the U.S. federal budget is the Advanced Manufacturing Office at the Department of Energy, and I'm showing the AMO's budget here. In addition to that, it's currently about $400 million a year. In addition to that, we have a network of institutes through DOE, Commerce, DOD, and NIH called the Manufacturing USA Institutes, and a couple of other programs, mostly at NIST. And so you put it all together and you get about $800 million per year that we're currently spending out of the federal budget on industrial R&D. Now, that might sound like a big number, but I would claim that that is entirely inadequate. And to make that point, I'll offer a few points of comparison. So the first comparison I'll make is to the healthcare sector here in the United States. The healthcare sector here in the United States employs fewer people and contributes less to GDP than the industrial sector. It is supported by the National Institutes of Health with a budget of about $40 billion per year, which is to say 50 times what we're spending on the industrial sector. Another comparison that I'll make is to what other countries are spending. So Germany, even though it has only about a fifth of our GDP, spends between $2 and $3 billion per year on its Fraunhofer institutes, which are similar to our Manufacturing USA institutes. Next slide. Okay, so in addition to the the low level of funding overall, it's also a disproportionately low level of funding compared to key metrics like employment, like greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a slide that I took from a report written by Tarek Shah with NRDC a couple years ago. On the left, you can see greenhouse gas emissions by sector. On the right, you can see DOE R&D spending, and that dark blue wedge is much, much smaller in the DOE spending than in the greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And then, so we have these really great programs that are doing really great work, but they're not at the scale that they need to be, and they're in important ways not aligned well with the social and sectoral needs. And so in addition to increasing the scale, we need to do some work to realign how we spend this money. The biggest problem here is that the Advanced Manufacturing Office is housed within the Office of Energy Efficiency at DOE. And so the existing authorizations all emphasize energy efficiency and energy productivity. Now, those are admirable goals. Those are not necessarily at the top of anybody's list of what we want our manufacturing sector to deliver for America. Energy efficiency is great. It's not the top priority, and we need to make sure that we're focused on the top priorities. It Under current authorizations, it's very difficult to spend money through many of these programs, particularly at AMO, on R&D projects that improve climate performance, that reduce pollution, particularly targeting environmental justice and improving those outcomes. You also it's very difficult to justify expenditures to improve other social outcomes like worker safety or technologies that promote job quality. And those are all things that should be considered in our manufacturing and industry R&D portfolio. That kind of lopsided set of priorities also reflects that many stakeholders have no opportunity to influence these priorities. There's a lot of opportunities for manufacturing firms to influence how R&D money gets spent and which projects are selected. There's very, very little opportunity for workers, whether in unions or not, for people who live in communities that house industrial facilities, and for other people who have legitimate stakes in the future of American manufacturing. Very little opportunity for them to influence our R&D priorities. Next, our current set of programs really looks almost exclusively at manufacturing, when in fact what we need to be doing is looking at manufacturing, construction, and waste processing in an integrated way. There's enormous opportunities that come from that integration that we're currently not seizing. And commercial scale demonstration of new process technologies is difficult or impossible. One of the major reasons for that is the low level of overall funding. One of the new process demonstrations that people are most excited about these days is a project in Sweden called Hybrid that's for that's doing hydrogen reduction of steel. So this is a new way to make steel that almost eliminates greenhouse gas emissions. Steel is the highest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the world. So this is a super important project that is going to set Sweden up for potentially technology leadership for decades to come. This one project is costing about $300 million. And so if the entire budget is only $400 million, we simply are not going to be able to do these projects. Next slide, please. There have been some promising new developments, but not at the scale required. So the Energy Act of 2020, which was passed, included the Industrial Emissions Technology Program, which set up a project, set up an administrative structure for doing technology demonstrations, but the authorizations provided were not at the scale that is going to be needed. The authorization under this act for next year is just $20 million, which will grow to $150 million. It also instructed DOE to make an industry decarbonization roadmap in collaboration with OSTP. As Deputy Secretary Turk mentioned, the American Jobs Plan also has some interesting things in it. It particularly calls out hydrogen and carbon capture demonstration projects and says there'll be $15 billion over 8 years for demos. That sounds like a lot of money, but in comparison, the equivalent project in Europe is the EU Horizon Fund, which is 100 billion euros over 10 years, which is a much more attractive sum of money than $15 billion over 8 years. So next slide, please. Finally, I want to leave you with a couple of recommendations. First of all, total industrial innovation investment should be in the range of $5 billion per year across the government. So we need to be increasing much more, much faster. And in addition to increasing funding, we need to elevate this agenda and improve governance. Many people are somewhat shocked to learn that currently the highest ranking person in the federal government, whose job is to advance the future of American manufacturing, has the rank of acting office director. At a bare minimum, DOE needs an assistant secretary for manufacturing and industry. And finally, this innovation agenda needs to be integrated with policies that create markets, invest in the workforce, ensure fair trade, and enforce the rules already on the books. If we do all of these things, though, there's an enormous opportunity for us to not just reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve our environment, but have a huge step forward for American competitiveness and provide a foundation for solid middle-class jobs and stable prosperity. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this with my fellow panelists. And we published a report in December that looks at some of these issues in more detail, which you can find on our website. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's a great report. Please check it out if you haven't seen it. Certainly when I hear industrial innovation, I think of competitiveness and climate change. But I want to turn it over to Erin to talk about our final issue area before we get into the discussion.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. So thank you so much for having me here. It's such an exciting time to be talking about carbon removal, RD&D, and I want to share a little bit about where we've been, why it is such an exciting time to be talking about this, and what the future of this could look like. Because I think a lot of the things that we're seeing around carbon removal are really a microcosm of some of these larger issues around the future of the Department of Energy. So first, I want to talk a little bit about where we've been historically on carbon removal investment. You've probably been hearing way more about carbon removal in the past couple of years or the past 6 months than you ever did before sort of 2019, 2018. And that was really where we were with funding. So before FY20 and looking before 2019, we basically had no dedicated carbon removal funding. If you look at something like direct air capture, there were really like maybe $11-ish million ever spent across the federal government. Some of that went to things, a few million, for example, went to things like the National Academy's report that came out in 2018. So very negligible amounts of funding. That really changed starting in FY20. And then there were a few reasons for this. I mentioned the National Academy's report. So at the end of October, the National Academy put out a report on how you might create a federal R&D program for negative emissions technologies. Around the same time, the IPCC put out a report on 1.5 degrees and showed that basically all pathways to stay below 1.5 and most to stay below 2 required carbon removal. And so you had this moment where folks understood carbon removal is really essential for climate, and you need to start investing in the R&D piece right now. And that catalyzed a lot of action. So in FY20, we had about $60 million at the Department of Energy. In FY21, about $90 million at the Department of Energy. And that's really just at the Department of Energy. And I think this is something that's really important about carbon removal is not just direct air capture. It is not just negative emissions technologies. And it's not just a question of what happens at the Department of Energy. This is a multi-agency effort with the Department of Energy leading the way. I want to talk a little bit about why right now is such an exciting time for carbon removal. There are a couple of things that have happened recently that have gone from taking carbon removal from that sort of tens of millions of dollars to something, again, that you're probably hearing about pretty consistently. One is at the end of last year in the Energy Act, Congress authorized a ton of new programs around carbon removal. So that funding that had been provided in FY20 and FY21 was kind of put into existing DOE programs. There was not a carbon removal program that they were funding. There wasn't sort of a dedicated carve out for carbon removal in the authorizations. This was just something that was kind of stuck across offices at the Department of Energy. But that really changed at the end of last year. So the Energy Act of 2020 included the first ever federal carbon removal R&D program authorization. It authorized at just the Department of Energy a direct air capture prize, a direct air capture test center. It also had really big increases for the carbon storage program, for the carbon use program. And so a lot of the pieces that are really related to negative emissions technologies and carbon removal more broadly also got big increases. For example, the carbon storage program has been at about $80 million a year, and the new authorization is $200 million. So really big increases across the board for some key carbon management issues. Another thing that was really important that happened over the past year is an enormous amount of support from the new administration. So we saw in the campaign and the transition team call outs for negative emissions technologies and carbon removal. I'll say we were especially excited to see some of the staffing decisions at the Department of Energy around Office of Fossil Energy. Our former colleague and Deputy Director of Policy, Dr. Suchi Talati, is now Chief of Staff at the Office of Fossil Energy. You have Dr. Jen Wilcox there. So you have people who are really involved in carbon removal leading the Office of Fossil Energy. We also saw call outs in the president's skinny budget for carbon removal. And again, this was such a big deal because if you look back a couple of years ago, you're not seeing carbon removal in the budget at all, let alone a skinny budget or these high level discussions of what's in the president's budget. So that was a really pivotal moment for carbon removal. There's also something else, and Dave mentioned this at the beginning, but this administration, and if you look at the Secretary's testimony in front of Energy and Commerce today, is thinking about carbon management technologies, carbon capture, carbon removal in such a different way. They're really talking about the Office of Fossil Energy in a new way, where they're thinking about using these technologies as a way to drive towards climate action. They're talking about these technologies, to some of Rebecca's points, as ways to decarbonize hard to decarbonize sectors. So not just as something that is about continued fossil use or decarbonization in the electricity sector, but about industrial decarbonization. And they're also talking about this in line with things like key environmental justice priorities, which is just very, very different from how it's been talked about in the past. And a really, I think, exciting moment for carbon removal, where we have an administration, we have a Congress who want to invest in carbon removal in a big way and are thinking about this in a really forward-thinking way. So thinking about this in terms of how it can support communities and be in line with key environmental justice and labor priorities, and can be in line with climate goals and be really motivated by those pieces, rather than sort of how we've seen the Office of Fossil Energy work in the past. I also want to talk a little bit about what the future of carbon removal could look like, because we've had all these new authorizations. We have the administration kind of signaling that this is something that's of interest to them, but we're right now in a moment where we don't necessarily know exactly what that's going to look like. So next Thursday, of course, we'll have more clarity on the administration's budget requests. We'll hear from appropriators in the coming months what they're going to fund these new programs at. But I think in particular, beyond the just the questions of how much money is carbon removal going to get, there are a couple of key questions about how the Department of Energy is going to work on carbon removal that, again, are really, I think, in a lot of ways, a kind of microcosm of larger questions about the future of the Department of Energy. So first is that new program that was authorized, the carbon removal program. It's kind of unclear where at the Department of Energy it will be. It seems likely that it'll be in the Office of Fossil Energy, and there are a lot of reasons to put it there. And, the administration suggestions, how they talk about the budget and how they talk about the Office of Fossil Energy, and in particular things like their suggested renaming of the office to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management suggests that perhaps we'll see it there. But it's not necessarily clear from the authorization, and it's framed as a carbon removal program. And specifically, if you look at the Energy Act and the carbon removal title, you'll see not just things like direct air capture or bioenergy with CCS, you'll see call outs of forestry and agricultural practices. In that previous funding, in the past couple of years, I talked a little bit about the beginning where we saw tens of millions of dollars, really 60, 90 million dollars going to carbon removal. Wasn't all at the Office of Fossil Energy. It was also in ERE, it was also in science. You've seen earlier this year, the Office of Science put out a FOA for direct air capture. So we've seen why. I think there's a question here, and I think this also gets at some of the comments that Rebecca made of how is the Department of Energy organized overall? And I think in particular, carbon removal, where is this going to fit, and how are you going to see that interagency coordination on issues ranging from bioenergy to forestry practices to direct air capture? I think the second big question around carbon removal is, what are those goals of the carbon removal program? And if we do expect to see it at the Office of Fossil Energy, how does it fit into those goals at the Office of Fossil Energy? If you look back 5-10 years ago about the Office of Fossil Energy's goals, a lot of that was motivated by continued use of or production and use of fossil fuels. And what we hope to see, and what we think we've started to see from this administration, is more of a focus on these technologies in terms of how they can be used for decarbonization and for meeting climate goals. In addition, you have new positions at the Department of Energy around worker transition and environmental justice. And we've always had these sort of goals of using carbon management technologies, direct air capture, point source carbon capture, in sort of worker transition, places like my home state of West Virginia. And now you have a Department of Energy that could be set up to be thinking about how these technologies work, not just to, one, that now we're focused on them for, how they can help us meet climate goals, but also how they can serve really important roles in thinking about, as Rebecca pointed out, American manufacturing, and worker transition and key environmental justice priorities around not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but other pollutants, and sort of things like community development. One thing that I'll mention is there was a really interesting FOA that came out, a funding opportunity announcement from the Department of Energy recently that I think for the first time ever had really strong requirements around community engagement. And so again, I think when you look at what the future of the carbon removal program might look like, seeing FOAs come out from the Office of Fossil Energy that do prioritize community engagement, I think it's a really interesting question of how the Department of Energy is going to orient this program. The last thing I'll say about the future of carbon removal, and something that we're really focused on, is there are also, because this is a carbon removal program, we're not just talking about the technological piece of this. We're talking about agricultural practices. We're talking about forestry practices. And you're starting to see that what this means is not just the sort of interagency coordination at DOE, but also cross-agency coordination at the federal level. So there are bills like the CREATE Act in Congress that are really focused on pushing this coordination between DOI and USDA and DOE. There is a bigger question here about the role of the Department of Energy, and not just what they're doing, but in also that cross-agency coordination on carbon removal and other key climate issues. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm going to wrap up here. And I just want to say, many of us on the panel, and I'm sure in the audience, have been working on these issues around the future of DOE and increasing investments and changing how the Department of Energy works for years, for decades. And I think for CDR, but really for the Department of Energy more broadly, we're at such a unique moment of opportunity. And so I'm just really excited to be able to talk with my fellow panelists here today about what that might look like.
Thanks, Erin, for those great remarks. It's, Deputy Secretary Turk raised at the beginning that there's this emphasis they're putting on greater coherence and alignment. I think both you and Rebecca have addressed that from the perspective of both CDR and industry. I'd like to put that question to David now to start off. What do you think greater coherence and alignment at DOE looks like?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's about aligning across the value chain. So Deputy Secretary alluded to that. The Undersecretary position now includes both the science office and the applied programs. And I think there's a need to, drill down further. So obviously having one official at the top of all that is a start, but there's going to be a need to build collaboration throughout the value chain. And then I think both of the areas that Rebecca and Erin have talked about are ripe for coordinating mechanisms, whether they're like the Grid Modernization Consortium, or some other kind of structure. There are always going to be important technology silos at DOE, and that cross-cutting mechanism is what has always been a challenge. So I think that's something that this administration is going to have to work hard at. My sense is that the people who work at DOE are enthusiastic about the mission expanding in ways that we've talked about. And the challenge is then to build these administrative structures that can harness that enthusiasm and the tremendous expertise, again, that the Deputy Secretary spoke of.
Thanks, David. It's certainly a lot for the department to take on, in addition to, your remarks at the beginning about how historically this hasn't been the national mission that it needs to be. So having energy innovation take on a higher profile at the same time as you reorganize to do things like environmental justice and worker transition better, that's a lot to take on. So I'm also excited to see where the department goes. I want to dig in, there was a question in the chat about how ARPA-E and ARPA-C and some of the other elements that have been mentioned in some of the president's, both the jobs plan or the skinny budget. There was a question about the Office of Technology, OTT, technology transfer, and that reauthorization. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on sort of that, how you see an ARPA-E or an ARPA-C working together, how you see these new elements coming into play, and how that interacts with anything that you, Aaron or Rebecca, offered during your remarks. And feel free to just jump in.
I'll take a quick crack at the ARPA-C question and then maybe kick it over to the others. So I see ARPA-C as a way of extending the principles of ARPA-E into areas that aren't necessarily within DOE's authorization. It's a little still unclear exactly how it's going to work, since they're talking about a cross-agency, which is kind of confusing. But there are climate innovation challenges that don't fall squarely within DOE's mission. And I think ARPA-E has proven that it can really be effective at getting technologies out of the lab to the level of prototyping. Now, that doesn't solve the scaling problem yet, but it's an important tool. So to extend that into some new areas, that's the way I see it working.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. I'll say, I think the RBE has obviously done some really fantastic work. We're really excited about ARPA-C. I would say what I hope to see, though, too, is that we see a similar level of investment in the applied offices as we've seen in ARPA-E. I think that there can be a lot of, if I think about how Congress engages on these, there can be a lot of enthusiasm for ARPA-E. I think sometimes it's not as cool, like the applied offices sometimes, and maybe this is coming from working on FE for a decade, but it's not as exciting sometimes, or the pitch isn't as clear as ARPA-E. So I do want to say, I think while we hope, ARPA-E, ARPA-C continue to get these massive investments, that's really aligned with also very massive investments in the applied offices and some of the stuff that maybe isn't quite as cool.
On that, I entirely agree with what Aaron said. And, as the kind of the general principle is, as technologies become more and more mature, the portion of the funding that comes from the government goes down. However, as technologies become more and more mature, the things you have to do to make them better become more and more expensive. And so we do really need to, so I think ARPA-E is wonderful. I will note that, I will note that in the history of ARPA-E, they have, of their 64 different programs, only one of them has ever focused on manufacturing. But I think we need to make sure that we maintain the balance between the ARPA type investment and the real, like, getting it to full commercial readiness investments that are happening in the applied offices.
Thanks, all. It does raise an interesting set of questions about how this gets organized and implemented, and how you get to, as you pointed out, David, sort of that, how you actually create the chain that needs to happen to get all the way to commercialization and deployment. I'd like to ask, a question came up in the chat about the regional innovation hubs, and I think the Deputy Secretary and Rebecca, maybe you also mentioned the $20 billion in regional innovation hubs that's called out in the American Jobs Plan. Can you say a little bit more, Rebecca, about how you see that interacting with goals for manufacturing? And Aaron, I'd be interested in how you see those types of investments interacting with carbon dioxide removal and other storage work. And David, anything from ITIF perspective that you see as those as a critical path for getting all the way to commercialization of these? Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this kind of regional approach is, I think, particularly important for manufacturing because there's so much regional variation in what industrial economies look like. So what the industrial economy looks like on the Gulf Coast is completely different from how it looks here in California, which is completely different from how it looks on the Great Lakes, which is completely different from how it looks in the Pacific Northwest. Every part of this country has an industrial economy, but there really needs to be an approach that centers the particular circumstances of different states and regions. And so I think this, I really like the idea of empowering these regional hubs.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if I look at the history of kind of carbon management work, we've got the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership. I think similar to what Rebecca said, when on this and the previous question, we're really ready for a lot of these carbon removal practices, the carbon removal technologies, point source, CCS, to be deployed. I think that we're not just talking about, we're really excited about innovation. We have an entrepreneurship and entrepreneur in residence program that just wrapped up. There are new technologies coming down the pike, but I think, working with regions to start thinking about how these practices and technologies are going to be deployed, making sure that we think through, if I think about some of the barriers to deployment for point source carbon capture that are also going to be a challenge for things like direct air capture, I think about the Class 6 program at EPA and some of these things that are really tied up with the success. You aren't just looking about, if we're talking about the Department of Energy as a deployment agency, as a climate agency, which we certainly hope to see at Carbon 180, we're going to have to think about what are all of those barriers to deployment and what role does the Department of Energy have? Can the Department of Energy support modeling capacity for Class 6 permits? Can they provide technical assistance and recommendations for improvement for the Class 6 program? And that's just like one particular example, but I do think that you're going to have, if you're able to work from a regional level, figure out which regions the other thing I'll say about this from the regional approach is I think, and something that's come up recently with the White House EJ Advisory Council report, and it's kind of how they approach CCS and how they approach carbon removal, and something that's been a part of our environmental justice initiative is we want these to be deployed in places that want them. And I think we can start working with regions on how to deploy them in ways that do benefit communities, and I think align with a lot of those priorities we're seeing from this administration. So I think there are sort of a myriad of benefits if we do take a more regional approach and to complement sort of what's happening at DOE right now.
So I endorse what my fellow panelists have said, and I want to frame it a little bit more broadly and give credit to Rob Atkinson, the head of ITIF, who's been working on regional economic development, technology-based regional economic development for a long time. The energy and climate pieces are part of a broader set of strategies around this theme. So it's not just confined to the industries that we're talking about here. And it's an important part of the Endless Frontiers Act. And Rob and Mark Miro at Brookings wrote an important report that laid that out. And I encourage folks to look at that. And one of the things that I find is really exciting about this approach is that it can bring the states and localities in as partners. And all of these places are interested in economic development. They want to see a brighter future for themselves, and they want to control and shape that future. And so the federal government ought to be a partner at that level, because there's a lot of knowledge at that level. There's a lot of enthusiasm at that level. And so I think if we're going to turn this theme of opportunity and hope around the energy transition and the climate fight, into reality, it's going to take those kinds of partnerships. So I'm really excited for the DOE to be part of that overall strategy on the part of the national government.
Thanks all. I want to ask a couple more questions before we have to conclude for the day. So my first one is, we've heard a lot about sort of budgets, but Erin, you just mentioned a few things, expanding authorizations for things like the Class 6 well program at EPA, or giving DOE new authorities, right? So building on the Energy Act of 2020, there's certainly an appropriations moment now, right, to increase that spending. But where does Congress need to come in to go beyond the appropriations process in the authorizing committees in Energy and Natural Resources, or in Energy and Commerce, or in Science in the House? What do they need to be thinking about this year, especially with an infrastructure package on the horizon? You've got the American Jobs Plan as a blueprint, but what would you tell them to prioritize? Anyone who wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, I think I've given away the game by inviting these two panelists here. So I think these two areas that we've highlighted are really important. And then I would also emphasize demonstrations more broadly, not just obviously the industrial area, but there are other areas as well, including carbon removal, where there are some opportunities for demonstration. So all those may need some authorization. Some of it is already packaged, but I think there are certainly new things to do in those areas.
Thank you so much for the invitation, David. It's great to be able to talk about these issues. I would say that in addition to my repeated emphasis on we just need a lot more dollars on manufacturing innovation, we also do need we need to empower DOE and other agencies to use that money in a more expansive way. And so I already mentioned the problem with, having AMO within the Office of Energy Efficiency. Like, as I said, I love energy efficiency. I was recently challenged to list the, what should be our top priorities for what we want from the American manufacturing sector broadly considered. And when I wrote them out in order, energy efficiency came in at number 7. So like that can't be what structures this. And so broader authorizations that allow DOE and other agencies to spend their money on a wider set of social priorities, that's critical. And I think that the issue of elevating leadership in this area with an assistant secretary, with potentially other senior roles at other departments, that's critical. Manufacturing is incredibly important, and it is a driver of the middle class. And we need a strong manufacturing sector, and we need agencies across the government to be engaged in that project. And it is just, it's sad but true. The government's a very hierarchical place, and it is very hard to have an effective interagency process when everybody's at the staff level. If we want transformational change, we need empowered high-level leadership.
I totally agree. I think, again, in addition to just like a lot more money and appropriations, going really big on demonstrations, I think a couple of other things that I would mention really quickly. One is thinking again about how the current DOE is organized. To Rebecca's point, I think not always in the way that is like most relevant to the challenges we're dealing with right now. I think making sure that authorizers support DOE. This really comes down, I think, a lot about the loan program. And I think there was so much backlash against Cylinder in a way that was so deeply unhelpful to what is actually a good program. And I think getting more comfortable with programs and with failures at the Department of Energy, like that is the role of the Department of Energy. That's a role of the federal government. Like we are going to get so much more benefit if we're able to be a little riskier with what we're doing at the Department of Energy. And I think authorizers, whether that's codifying that in some way, but throughout the programs, but really providing that kind of critical support to DOE is really important. The other quick thing I would mention is I think thinking about how to make themselves really accessible to entrepreneurs and early stage companies. Sometimes it can be really difficult if you are a new company with a new technology and you are 3 engineers and you do not have a big lobbying firm. How do you even start to navigate the Department of Energy? And we spend a lot of time with our entrepreneurs and residents or with other companies thinking through this, and you see companies like Opus 12 in the carbon management space who've been able to be really successful because of this, or have had a lot of success in navigating that. But expanding SBIR, expanding access to things like these programs. So I think that's another thing that I'd be really interested to see Congress work on from an authorization perspective.
And I think just to add to that, setting up a private foundation to work with DOE, as many other federal agencies have, would be useful. And that's something that we've been working on for a number of years. And there's a real opportunity in this Congress to push that through, we hope.
Thanks all. Great recommendations. I want to give you all a chance for a final word. I just add, I think, to everything that's been said on this topic that demonstrations, absolutely. I think there's also a need for infrastructure. And we're also watching the tax space. I think there's an opportunity for some of these technologies to put in place tax policies that will go, again, beyond the RD&D phase, even though that's what we're talking about today, to really take us through the next decade, really. So I want to give folks a final word. I'm going to give you a little bit of a prompt, though. What's the one thing you're looking for in the budget announcement next week? When you get that detailed budget, what's the first thing you're going to try and find? And go ahead and offer anything else you want to add as final parting words.
I think this is easy for me. How much money are they giving to carbon removal? And where do they put it? You know, is it at FE? Are we seeing that continued emphasis on FE becoming a very different kind of office? So how are they tackling carbon management technologies? And I think that's just indicative of this moment where a lot of really cool things are happening, but we're at this moment of in carbon removal, both in the RDD and D space, but also more broadly where we're setting the foundation for how this is going to be scaled up, and we can do it in a way that's in line with climate and thoughtful about EJ priorities and worker transition, or we can go a different direction. So I think we're really excited to see how this administration tackles it.
Yeah, I have to agree. The first thing you look for in budgets is numbers. So I'm looking for what they recommend for core manufacturing activities at both DOE and Commerce.
And I'm going to be looking at the top line and then seeing whether they're starting to reallocate. So we want to see growth everywhere, but more growth in some things than others, and looking for the reallocation to those emission sources and technologies that have been relatively neglected. And I guess I should just wrap up, and let me just thank the panelists for joining us, Deputy Secretary Turk, as well, the authors of the report, Colin Cunliffe and Lynn Nguyen, Kayleen Schreiber, who worked on the viz. I hope everybody will take advantage of the report. And now is the time to push, as Aaron, Rebecca, and Lindsay have all mentioned. This is a real moment of opportunity. And we're trying to provide some tools to help out with that, and I hope you all take advantage of them. So with that, we'll wrap and just say thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
A great report.